Both the Canon EOS R5 Mark II and the EOS R1 are two very capable cameras for wildlife photography, for professional wildlife photography. I have shot 10,000 of pictures with both of them and I really enjoyed using both of them, but there are also some key differences. And I'm not only talking about the resolution of the camera or the frame rate, there's also some more hidden features that you might not have heard about, but that actually I think make a big difference in the usability and sometimes can make a difference if you can get a shot or not. So in this video I want to compare these two cameras and also talk a bit about the Canon EOS R3 because it's quite similar in a way to the EOS R1 but also has some significant differences. And I want to compare these three cameras a bit for the key aspects that I think actually matter for wildlife photography. So I hope with this video I can help you to make a more informed decision when you purchase one of these cameras. So let's start with the price. Maybe after this, some of you can already leave the video. The, let's say, cheapest camera is the R5 Mark II that comes at around $4,300 US. The Canon EOS R3 costs around $4,500 US, but there is a quite big used market and I think it will get bigger over the coming months, so keep this in mind. And finally, the Canon EOS R1 is brand new and costs $6,300, so by far the most expensive of the three. As you can already see, there is a big difference between the R5 Mark II and the R1 in terms of the size and also in terms of the weight. The R1 comes with this more traditional flagship body that Canon used in all their professional cameras. However, if you compare it to a Canon EOS 1DX or 1DX Mark II Mark III, this one is much lighter. It weighs 1,115 grams, which is not nothing, but it's still light compared to a DSLR. The Canon EOS R3 has a very similar body. It's slightly smaller and slightly lighter with 1,015 grams. And finally, the R5 Mark II weighs 746 grams, so by far the lightest camera. Apart from the weight, I think also the form factor is very important. Here we have this integrated battery grip, which is really makes it so much nicer if you shoot a lot of vertical pictures, especially with a long telephoto lens, and if you handhold a lot. We have the same for the R3, which I unfortunately do not have here right now, but it's very similar than the R1. The R5 Mark II does not have this integrated battery grip. There is optional battery grips that you can use, and then you can also put two batteries inside, so it will last longer. However, I feel like the feeling is not as good as with this integrated battery grip on the R3 and R1. One important thing to mention is, of course, the battery. On the R5 Mark II, we have the LPE6P batteries, these rather small batteries, whereas on the R3 and R1, we have the much bigger LPE19 batteries, and they're not only bigger, they also last much longer. So I don't give too much importance to the official numbers because I think if you do wildlife photography, you shoot a lot of action, you take many bursts, you can get much more images than what is officially stated. So just to give you an example, with my R5 Mark II, I managed already to take 4,000 or 5,000 shots with one battery if there was really a lot of action happening. With the R1, I managed to take over 23,000 shots with one single battery and I still had 20% left. But let's go back to the official numbers. On the R5 Mark II, it's rated at 340 images if you use the Viewfinder. On the R3, we get 860 images. And finally, on the R1, we have 700 images. So on the R1 and R3, it's more than double than what we have on the R5 Mark II. And from my experience, this pretty much matches what I experienced in the real world. I felt like the difference was almost more than just double. It felt somewhere between double and three times as much battery on an R1 or R3 than on the R5 Mark II. The button layout of the cameras is also a bit different. So on the Canon EOS R5 Mark II, we have one button here in the front that for me is a bit hard to reach. I mean, I can reach it, but not very easily. Whereas the R1 and R3 have two buttons. I mean, two for horizontal and two for vertical. And they are much easier to reach and they are designed like in a different shape so that you can actually feel which button you touch, and this is really very nice. And I was using it on the R1, for example, to preset and recall a focus distance for these lenses that don't have this function built in. Another difference is that the R3 and the R1 both have this smart controller. So it's this AF on button that has a small touchpad on it where you can move the autofocus point around. You still have your traditional joystick if you prefer this one, but that's quite a nice option because you can move the autofocus point around and not needing to change the thumb from the joystick to the AF on button. So both the R3 and the R1 have it, but on the R1 you actually have two kind of points you can pressure. It has two types of resistance, like the shutter button that you can half press or fully press, and you can assign different functions to this. I think the functions that you can assign are a bit limited at the moment, but I hope Canon will still offer more of these. On top we have more buttons on the R1 and R3. However, especially on the R1 we have a white balance button that I think as a wildlife photographer, I just don't use it, maybe for shooting movies sometimes, but it's really not so important to me. And the exposure compensation is oddly not really doing what it says that it does in manual mode. In manual mode with automatic ISO, it's not changing the exposure compensation. So this is a bit weird, and these buttons cannot be reassigned for some reason, which is a bit a pity. If you shoot a lot of video and photo and you switch back and forth, I think you will really prefer the design or button layout from the R1 and R3, because here you have a video photo switch that you can easily reach with your thumb, even if you have small hands like me. Whereas on the R5, if you shoot with a big telephoto lens, you're a bit screwed because the switch is here. And you have a red record button on the right side, but this records with the like predefined setting, whatever you have on the C3 mode, and this might not always fit for the current situation, so you need to start filming and only then you can start making changes to your settings, which is a bit annoying. So if you film a lot, to be honest, this would already be a good or an important reason to maybe consider either the R1 or the R3. All cameras have dual card slots, but the R5 Mark II and the R3 have CF Express and SD card slots, whereas the R1 has dual CF Express Type B slots. And I think here the R1 clearly wins because like this you can shoot in parallel RAW without having this bottleneck effect of the slow SD card that we have on the R5 Mark II and on the R3. On the R3 it's not as bad maybe because you have only 24 megapixels, whereas here you have 45, and especially here you will really notice it. If you come from an older Canon camera like the R5, you will notice that both the R5 Mark II and the R3 have quite a big viewfinder, like from the outside, but the R1 viewfinder is just massive. I mean, look at this thing, it's huge, and I think this is the best viewfinder I ever had. It's very comfortable, and the magnification is 0.9, which is just enormous, and you have 9.4 million dots, so you get a very crisp and clear image. The R5 Mark II and the R3 share the same viewfinder. It has a magnification of 0.76, which is not small, but to be honest, compared to this, it feels small, and it also lags a bit behind the competitors. The resolution with 5.76 million dots is still perfectly fine for me. I just found it a bit small. Here it's so much bigger that I actually changed on the R1 now the setting that I have it a bit smaller, and on the side have all my shooting information in like some black bars so that they don't overlay with the image. I know that I have the same option with the R5 Mark II and with the R3, but there it's just, I felt if I activate this option, the viewfinder gets really too small, whereas here it still stays quite big. So the viewfinder is such a joy to use in the R1. All of them have this eye-controlled autofocus. However, the R3 has an older system and the R5 Mark II and the R1 have an updated system. It works quite well for me on the R5 Mark II and on the R1. When I use the R3, I need to say I didn't really bother to set it up for me. The screen is designed in a very similar way for all the cameras, so it has basically the same functions, and the size is also 3.2 inch for all cameras. The resolution differs. The R3 has a 4.15 million dots screen, whereas the R5 Mark II and R1 oddly have a lower resolution. It's only like 2.1 million dots or something. I need to say I'm still happy with these two screens, and for me the bigger viewfinder on the R1, for example, is more important than the higher resolution screen on the R3, so this is not a big deal for me. All the bodies have the IBIS, the in-body image stabilizer, and this has been improved a bit for the R5 Mark II and R1. It's rated half a stop higher. That's not a big difference, but might be noticeable in some situations. And let's stay at the sensor design. All of them have a stacked sensor, so there should be really minimal rolling shutter. However, the readout speeds are a bit different. I tried my best to find the numbers online, not always so easy, but from what I found, the R5 Mark II has a sensor readout speed of about 6.3 seconds, the R3 one of 5.5 seconds, and finally the R1 is the fastest with 3.3 seconds. Does this matter in the real world? I think it depends a bit what you shoot. I think in wildlife not so often. However, I had 1 or 2 images from bearded reedlings when they were taking off where I had some horizontal lines or banding visible. I had this much more often with my original R5. Now with the R5 Mark II it's much better. But with the R1 I took much more pictures of songbirds in flights or songbird fighting in flight, and I never had a single issue. So if you shoot a lot of action, I think both the R3 and the R1 are a bit better in the terms of rolling shutter. I think finally the resolution of the sensor is a big difference. On the R5 Mark II we have 45 megapixels, on the R3 and on the R1 we have only 24 megapixels. I've been told that this is mostly because the R1 and R3 were meant for press and sport photographers that don't need so many megapixels. However, for wildlife photography, unfortunately, we're sometimes in situations where we just need to crop a bit more. So did I miss these extra megapixels or not? So I took some test shots of this feather with some dark background where we should also see the noise if we push the ISO a bit more. And I started at 100 ISO, and if we zoom into the same size on the R1 and the R5 Mark II, we can see that the R5 Mark II clearly resolves more details. On both cameras, noise is not an issue as expected at 100 ISO. However, if we push the ISO a bit more, and I'm skipping some intermediate values here and go straight to 12,800 ISO, we see that the R5 Mark II still has a bit more details, but the R1 is also starting to show significantly less noise than the R5 Mark II. And this means that now in Lightroom I can actually increase the sharpening of the R1 file a bit. And if we now compare it, the noise levels are similar. Maybe the R1 has still a bit less noise. And in terms of details, they also start to look very similar, even though the R5 Mark II has still a small edge. If we now use some upscaling features from Lightroom with this AI upscaling, then it gets really close, and I feel like the R1 might actually produce the better file. So it depends a bit what you do. I think if you overall just prefer clean files and you can live with a little bit less resolution, the R1 is perfectly fine. If you really want to have all these megapixels and maybe you stay also rather in the lower ISO range usually, then I think the R5 Mark II is the better option. In the end, I was actually surprised that the difference between the two was not even as big as I would have expected. All of these three cameras are quite fast. If you shoot them in the mechanical shutter, they all do 12 frames per second. However, since they have stacked sensors, usually I shoot them in the electronic shutter. And here we see some differences. The R3 and the R5 Mark II both shoot 30 frames per second with continuous autofocus and in RAW. The R1, on the other hand, manages up to 40 frames per second. Not a huge difference, but I was taking some pictures of songbirds that were fighting with each other, and I was very happy to have the R1 with this 40 frames per second here. That being said, in like 90% of the situations, I slow the frame rate down to like 15 or 20 frames per second on all cameras, because otherwise it's just, I end up with too many images that all look alike. The buffer is a bit different between the cameras, and I'm now mentioning the buffer that Canon states if you write to the CF Express card. So with the R5 Mark II you can get 93 images if you shoot RAW and 170 if you shoot C-RAW with the fastest frame rate, like 30 frames per second. On the R1 it's 230 frames in RAW and 410 in C-RAW, and with the R3 150 in RAW and 420 in C-RAW. Keep in mind, if you want to shoot parallel on two cards, the R1 will win because both the R5 Mark II and the R3 will drop significantly because of the SD card being the bottleneck in the end. From practice, I never had an issue of hitting the buffer with the R1 once. I need to say that I shoot 0 all the time anyway. With the R5 it was also mostly fine, but I could imagine that there might be some rare situations where 170 frames are not enough. It's 6 seconds of non-stop shooting in 0. This should be enough for most of the situations, but the R1 offers a bit an advantage here. The Canon EOS R1 is the first and so far only camera from Canon that features a cross-type AF sensor, and this is supposed to be more precise, especially if you're like, at least as I remember it from DSLR times, if you're like in low light situations or try to focus on a subject which does not have much contrast. So far I didn't really feel big differences, but I think this will need more testing. In general, the AF is a bit better on the R5 Mark II and R1 compared to the R3, but even the R3 does still a very good job in the autofocus. One really big difference between these cameras is the pre-burst. So the R3 does not have a pre-burst, which I found a bit sad that Canon never introduced this by a firmware update. Maybe it's technically not possible, I really don't know. However, on the R5 Mark II we have 15 frames pre-burst. On the R1 it's 20 frames, so in the fastest frame rate setting this corresponds to half a second pre-burst on both cameras, and half a second is really more than enough for me. I was very happy with this, and there were really some shots that I would not have gotten without the pre-burst. I don't want to talk too much about video because I have not tested the cameras in deeply enough to talk much about this. I had the R5 Mark II overheating once when I was filming myself another time, and after 40 minutes it was starting to overheat at room temperature and shut down. With the R1 I never had a problem, even when filming the same time or even longer, but I cannot make much statements here, so just watch another YouTube channel that really focuses on video and compares these cameras. Overall, I think there is no right tool for everybody. I think if you want this 45 megapixels, get the R5 Mark II. If you want the fastest camera possible and the most professional, I think the R1 is your friend. If you like this big rugged body, but you don't want to spend so much money and maybe you don't shoot so much action, so you don't need the pre-burst, then the R3 could be an interesting option, especially used. I would maybe not buy it new at this point, but used, I think it can be a very interesting option, and I expect the more R1s are actually hitting the market, the more we will also find used R3s to better and better prices. I think for most photographers I would recommend to get either the R5 Mark II or the R1 and not the R3, simply because the pre-burst for me is such an essential tool by now, and they have also some other more modern features such as the autofocus that is a bit improved, that for me these two are the better choices for most situations. I think many people will be more happy with the R5 Mark II. Many also enjoy the smaller form factor because it's lighter. And I also need to say sometimes I don't like that integrated battery grip because it makes the camera so much bigger and heavier. On the other hand, you have more buttons to configure and it fits a bit nicer in your hand. So it comes down to personal preference. I hope this video was helpful for you. If you're planning to pick up one of the cameras, I put affiliate links down below in the video description. If you buy over them, you just support my channel with no extra cost for you.